Hello all, I'm Nolan Hartwick. This is the review session for December 11th. Tonight I will be covering how Python modules work, as well as showing off a little bit of Flask and SQL Alchemy magic stuff. Unless there are any questions, are there any questions before I begin?
Nope.
Okay, perfect. I went ahead and posted this folder 12-11 in the Slack channel. You guys all should have been able to unzip it, download it, and unzip it and take a look at it if you wanted to. But basically, there are four files. This last file is a SQLite file, which is a database file, and it's going to be used by app.py, which is a file that is based on the 10th activity from last week, I believe. We also have this file, which is sequences.py, which implements a couple of functions. And we also have this file, test.py, which is going to be used to demonstrate some stuff. So, what is a module? The short answer is that any .py file can be a module. Anytime you have a .py file, you can import that file into some other project. So, for example, here I have a file named sequences.py. This file defines a module called sequences. As a result, I can import that module by calling import sequences. Every time you have ever done an import statement, what it's basically doing is finding that file, usually in the standard library or in one of your other packages, and executing some code and running that module and then loading it in as a module. And this is just a really quick example of that. This works the same way as when we were doing those config files. Those were just normal imports, the same as any other module that you have ever imported. And the real reason I wanted to bring this up and teach you guys about it a bit is because this little bit of technology came up in our lecture last week. And in order to understand what this does, you have to have some understanding of how modules work. So really quickly, let's just read through this file. We have two functions. The first is fib, and you guys should be familiar with this if you watched the review from 2 weeks ago, I think. It's gonna compute Fibonacci numbers. Pretty straightforward. We also have this new function called Pascal's triangle, which is going to compute the value found in Pascal's triangle, which is this thing, if you guys are familiar with it. It's a pretty common algebra sequence. So we have these two functions. We also have this print line, which is going to print this weird variable called dunder name dunder. Every time you are executing Python code, this variable is defined. It's just one of the built-in variables that Python makes whenever you are doing pretty much anything at all, and you have access to it. In this case, what it's doing is asking, what is the name of this current file that I'm working with? So when I import this module as sequences, its name is going to be sequences. And when I import it as sequences, because its name is sequences, its name will not be dunder main dunder. And as a result, when I import this module, none of this code will be executed. And this is the reason we use this technology. Often it is the case that you want to write a module and have things that will only execute when you run the module, as if it's a script. So here I'm using Sublime Text, and I just entered in Control V, which runs the current script. And what it did is went through, it defined two functions, it hit this print line, and because I ran this as a script, this module's name is now Dunder main, and it prints this module's name is Dunder main. We then hit this if line. It says I'm running it as a script. My name is Dunder main. This passes, and we actually execute these lines of code, which I'll come back to in a bit. Whereas if I import sequences, the module is still going to be executed, but now its name is the actual module name. And you'll notice that none of these lines of code executed. That's the point of the tech. We often want to define modules and have access to things and be able to import those functions or classes in some other context. And we also often want to be able to run that module as if it was a script. And that's what this is doing. This is basically separating out the things that are definitions, which is all of this stuff, from the things that are actually just a script that will execute and do a thing. Now, what does this do? So the first thing that we do is we print the module name again, just for example. The next thing that I do is import this module called doctest, which you guys haven't seen before. It's pretty straightforward. Basically what it does, when you call doctest.testmod, it looks at the current module, and it's going to look at all the functions, read through the doc strings. You guys should remember what doc strings are. And it's going to execute these lines and check to make sure that they return the value below. So when I run doctest.testmod, it looks at this function and says, does Pascal's triangle 0, 0 return 1? Does Pascal's triangle 2, 1 return 2? And if any of these failed, so if I just change these, doctest will report that it was an error and it encountered some failed test. This module is really useful when you want to write functions and build in examples that can show people how to use those functions, as well as write tests for your functions. Because I don't know if you've all noticed this yet, but most of the time you spend programming is probably spent testing your code. This is one of many ways that you can test your code. Does anyone have any questions on Python modules, these functions?
Yes, the doctest.testmod, they would be checking the comment section.
Yes.
Oh wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it reads through your comment basically. Keep in mind that this isn't really a comment, this is a doc string.
Okay.
The first string after a definition becomes that object's doc string, and you can actually access it by doing something like help of Pascal's triangle will invoke the doc string.
Nice.
So you can see the function definition and really briefly my doc string. And it's this doc string that the test mod will access.
Thank you.
Similarly, the first string that occurs in a module at the top of a module defines that module's doc string. And we can access those module level doc strings by just calling help on the imported module. So you can see that this module's name is sequences, or sorry, no. Here's where the docstring starts. And if the module includes functions, it will also give you the functions docstrings. Yeah. This is just some ways that you can document your code, which you should be doing. Whenever you define a function, you should probably have some kind of comment like this. Not necessarily formatted exactly this way, but something. Any other questions? Okay, moving on. So this app.py is basically an extension of activity 10 from last week, from last Saturday specifically. And it's just it's an extended example of working with Flask and SQL Alchemy. So we do a lot of imports here. Don't worry about those right this second. There's nothing particularly new here anyway. We create our engine, which is going to connect to the SQLite file that I included in this folder. We go ahead and automap the engine, automap that database, and we can get the passenger table. Start a session so that we can interact with the database. We set up our Flask app, and then we start creating some web pages, basically. So we have root. This is an extended version of the home that was defined earlier. I've added 3 functions. This is exactly the same. This is an example of using pandas with SQL Alchemy. So you can do session.query passenger or any other. If you want to do a filter, you can do those too. And I believe I do one later in this script. And we can do pd.readSQL, results query statement, session.bind, and that's is going to fetch, it's going to read our SQL data and format it into a pandas data frame. We can convert this data frame to a dictionary and then JSONify it and return it as this web page. Here is a new one. This is just another example of something that you can do using Flask and SQL Alchemy. In this case, it's the web endpoint, the URL that will be entered is variable. People can enter any name they want. And we will then query our passenger list and identify passenger names containing that name that was specified. We then read our table and format the results. It's similar to above. All we did was add a filter. The other thing is that SQL Alchemy has this cool function called iLike, and it's basically a non-case sensitive version of like. And totally unrelated, but I figured I'd use them anyway. I went ahead and imported sequences. And I'm go ahead and adding both of those functions as API endpoints. So here we have the fid function, and you pass in some value in, and it will compute the nth fid term. We also have this, which you haven't seen yet. And if you remember when we were working with APIs before Thanksgiving, before the project, you would often see API endpoints that had a question mark followed by some keyword arguments. Let me see if I can find a quick example. Weather API. So here is one example. You can see that for this URL, we have this question mark and then Q equals some city name. If you want to support that type of functionality in your own APIs, you use this request.args.get, the name of the variable, and this is the default if the variable isn't present. So if I go ahead and run this, sorry, server is running on localhost. This is the home page I expect. Quickly verify that passengers works. Misspelled it, I assume. No. This is what our passengers database looks like. We can also query for some specific person, see if there's any Nolans. There's not. How about a Steve? Well, there's a Stevenson. Any other names anyone wants to try real quick? Anthony. Misspelled. So what's happening here is that Flask is taking this URL, chopping off this last bit, and because we have specified the URL in this way, it passes that last bit in as a string to specific passenger. And then we do the SQL Alchemy ORM stuff, which lets us execute our query, and we JSONify the results and return it to the user. This is very similar to what you guys have seen. Now let's check out the fib. So fib has one parameter. We can go ahead and do fib 30, which is apparently 832040. I don't know, I haven't checked. But it also optionally allows you to define extra arguments. Equals to, oh, I don't remember what the syntax is. So this should be the same. It is not. Apparently I didn't test this enough. What else? And what this is doing is changing the initial starting value in the Fibonacci sequence. And again, what's happening here is that this bit before the question gets chopped off and gets passed as n. This bit gets passed in request.args as fib0. And I should be able to define multiple, I just don't remember what the separator is. and. Sweet. But yeah, this is how all of those APIs that you guys used worked using something like what I've currently implemented in Flask. This bit gets chopped off and becomes the in parameter and gets passed to the function. These values get split up and get passed as a dictionary, which you can access using request.args.get. The request came from an import here from Flask. This triangle works very similarly, except it's calling a different function. I can show you guys that if you would like.
Yes, that sounds great.
2 base equals 10 is going to be way bigger. At least it should be. Oh, okay. So yeah, and the final thing that we do is if this module is being executed as a script, then we call app.run debug equals true. Let's kill that. We don't need that. So yeah, this is just another quick example of SQL Alchemy with Flask and ORMs. Anyone have any questions related to this little activity?
I had a question. So how does this work? When would you use Flask and when would you use plain HTML?
When would I use what?
Flask versus HTML, plain HTML.
So usually you use HTML is going to be static.
Okay.
Barring any widgets that you install which are running somebody else's scripts, an HTML page can't be easily modified. Like you would have to make every possible HTML page for every value of n in order to get something that functioned like this.
Okay, so maybe I should rephrase JavaScript versus Flask.
Yeah, that's more the question.
Well, for one thing, the Flask includes a lot of everything you do in JavaScript is going to be run on the remote browser, whatever the user's browser is, that's where the JavaScript gets run.
Okay.
Whereas all of this code gets executed locally on the server, and then it just sends the results to the user. So, for example, if I want to access a database, doing that in JavaScript is probably doable, but you'd be sending the user code to access your local database, which doesn't really make sense. It's better to just access your local server database and send the user the results.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you, Nolan.
Okay.
So for our project, the next project, we need to combine Flask and HTML, right?
Yes, you will be compliant. You will be using HTML with Flask.
Okay. How is that done?
We're going to be showing it to you probably later this week. I didn't want to introduce it.
Okay.
Introduce it to class. Basically, there's a function in Flask to generate HTML pages from some template. So if you have like a template HTML document, you can generate pages based on that template. and you can return the generated page. And it's just another function call. Instead of using JSONify to return raw strings, you use a different function call to return HTML strings, is pretty much how it works. If you really want to learn more about Flask, there's a very good tutorial called the Flask Mega Tutorial, which will walk you through pretty much everything. We're going to be going through a lot of this stuff as part of the class. We're also going to be missing some of it, but this is a really good tutorial if you really want to dig into Flask.
Awesome.
And posting it here. If anyone would like to see it.
Oh, it's this guy. So from my observation so far, Flask is used to navigate. Like navigates you to the right page.
Kind of. Flask is about letting users make requests to your server and do them on your server.
Okay.
As opposed to an HTML document, which is something that you just send to a user. That's a response to a request. It's also called a post. Or JavaScript, which is code that is being run by the user inside some HTML doc or run on some HTML doc. Like it's just about remembering what's running on the server and what's running on the browser. Flask runs on your server. It manages server tasks. The HTML and JavaScript and CSS are things that you send to the user to run there. The user runs those.
Oh, why did you convert the data set into pandas before JSONify it?
Did you ask why or where?
Why?
Because
I'm looking at it.
The original. Here, let me show you the
specific
original
passenger.
real quick. So this is the original activity.
Yeah.
And this is what they're doing to go through the hassle of converting the output into something that's JSON-like.
It's like a list.
And I didn't want to do that.
Okay.
So I just read it in directly.
JSONify anything. Could be data frame or lists or dictionary.
In this case, you JSONify dictionaries.
Okay.
You can JSONify a dictionary or a list. You cannot JSONify a data frame, but every
you
dictionary
converted
can be easily converted to a dictionary.
I see. Okay. Just different ways to convert everything into a dictionary.
Yeah.
Frame it. Yeah. Okay.
Also, the other advantage of this is that the value that I returned is going to be formatted in such a way that you can easily convert it back to a data frame. So right now we're making an example API. And if somebody wanted to use this API, then they would do the connections and they would go to the web page and they would do the request call, and then they would convert this to, they would get the JSON and convert it to a dictionary. And with the way that it was formatted, it would probably convert. Yeah, it would. It doesn't really matter, but you can just call pandas.dataframe on this dictionary and it's going to give you the same dictionary that I got, or the same data frame that I got. Everything is associated correctly. And I know that because pandas did it for me.
Just curious, is there a better way to publish data than in JSON form?
So there are other ways to do it. If you're considering creating an API, if you're just talking about publishing data in general, there's a lot of ways that you can do it. The simplest is probably just to have some file format that's easy to read in a lot of different languages. Something as simple as comma separated values, CSV files, and upload it to a public GitHub. That's a really easy way to share files.
What are the benefits for JSON again?
JSON is just a lot more flexible than CSVs.
Okay.
Like JSON can you can encode any dictionary as a JSON dictionary, whereas CSV requires you to have a square data set. So like a CSV file has rows and columns, and a JSON object doesn't necessarily have that. You could easily return, let me just quickly make something new. /test. Name. Where data goes to. So this is a dictionary, which would be really weird to represent in a CSV file.
Okay.
Because it's just two keys and they both go to different types of data. Like, I don't know how you would represent that in a CSV file, but it's trivial to represent it in JSON because JSON lets you just represent any dictionary.
Okay.
See this. I don't know if this was explicitly pointed out, but if you were ever running a Flask, running a script that implements a Flask module, if you edit that script, the server is going to restart automatically. So this little output is the output of this script, and it's keeping track of lots of stuff. But after I made that last save, the server restarted. So now I can go in here, go to and you get this dictionary, which would be really hard to store as a CSV.
See.
There are other powerful data storage formats that are pretty common for APIs. One of them is called XML. You can look that up.
XML. Okay.
It's kind of like HTML, but also not. Any other questions related to this topic or any others? We're kind of in open Q&A at this point, so if anyone has anything.
No, I think
one thing. Sorry.
You guys curious what this does? How's the homework going? Has anyone looked at it?
Yeah, I'm about to start tonight after the review session.
Sure.
Yeah, I looked at it, but I was getting confused with how to do date manipulations for calculating what was the 1 year back and so on. I found the max date, but I couldn't figure out how to do 1 year back.
So I haven't looked at the homework yet either. Let's see what it looks like, shall we?
That sounds great. I was trying to identify which activities applied, and I came up with the same thing as you did about the max date.
That's not what I wanted to do. Is this the right button?
Yeah.
Ah, crap, I didn't install it. Give me like 2 seconds. Down. No, it just doesn't want to work. Whatever. Da, 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 da. So you're having issues with this first section about getting the last year of results?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I wanted to calculate. I wanted to find out how to calculate 1 year back. So I'm used to SQL where you can just do a date add function and give the date. But then I realized here SQL Alchemy considers date as a string. So I wasn't sure if I should split the date, month, and year into integers and then add and then put them together. There has to be an easier way to do it.
There probably is. It's also worth noting that SQL Alchemy doesn't view dates as strings.
Oh, it doesn't? Okay. My mistake.
No. SQLite does, but SQL Alchemy doesn't. SQL Alchemy is going to interpret those dates as datetime objects or date objects.
Okay. My mistake. I would have mixed things up then.
You're good.
I had the same problem with a date because it was coming out as string, but then I found something from Stack Overflow where you can just do the date function. So max date dot date function seemed to convert it to a data type.
Okay, I'll check that out. Yeah, I did something like this, date descending and then first or something like that to find the max date. But I wasn't sure how to add or subtract 1 year.
Yeah, I tried the SQL too because the the subtract syntax, but it didn't work. But if you go to the datetime documentation, it has that that equation. You just subtract. I did the max date too. Max date minus date time. I think it was time delta. Also, I think it's in activity 2, like day 3. There's an example there, but it was 1 week.
Mhm.
So if you just do 1 year, then it will, it'll do
Yeah.
the year. Yeah,
So
there.
looks like this is how you can do it.
Okay, so 365 instead of 7. Got it. Oh, thank you.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And she is correct that this is activity 2
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
from Saturday.
No, did you upload the solution?
To last Saturday? I believe so.
Yep. Okay.
If I did not, that was a mistake and it needs to be fixed. Nope, wrong week. This one.
Great. Okay.
I uploaded them for at least one. And let's just check this last one. Yep. Looks like they're all up there. If you find any missing, let me know and I'll fix it.
Okay. Got it.
Any other questions related to the homework or to any of the content we've been discussing?
So Nolan, when you have the, what do you call it, dunder main dunder?
Yeah.
So are those like system variables or something like that?
Yeah, they're so Python doesn't really have system variables. It's going to let you modify anything. But whenever you see a dunder value dunder, that's Python communicating to you that you probably shouldn't be messing with it.
Okay.
And it's acting like a system variable. It's something that is hooked into Python in a deep way and probably shouldn't be changed. Feel free to read them. In this case, we're reading it just to see if it equals main, but I wouldn't modify it if I were you, unless you know what you're doing. And there are other values like this. Like if you just do, I think this is the function. No, it's not. No. You can read about them in the Python documentation.
Okay.
Another common one you're going to see is file. Well, this is probably the best little resource I can find in this 10 seconds.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the first time we saw this was in the ORM class initialization.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering what that was.
It's really just whenever you see this is really common. What this is doing is saying, don't execute the stuff inside this if statement unless you're running this as a script. Unless you're running this from the command line or from as your main script. And yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? None of you are curious what this actually does or how this works?
Which one?
The app route?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about it, but I've watched some other videos in between, so that's why I haven't asked. But yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective. You always have a good way of putting it.
Well, just the syntax is something you guys haven't really seen before, and I'm probably going to be covering in the next review session. But it has to do, this is called a decorator, if you would like to learn more about them. A decorator is a function that returns a function. Or a decorator is a function that accepts a function as an argument and returns a function. So you can do like, this is going to do pretty much nothing, but it runs. He decorated a function. Hooray! It did a thing. So yeah, this @ symbol, whenever you see that above a function, it's called a decorator. And I'll go through that in more detail in the next review session. But I don't really have time to get into it now, unfortunately. Preview. You can read more about them in between if you would like.
Okay.
Anything else before we wrap up?
No, just thank you.
Okay, well,
All right.
Thank you, Nolan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nolan.
good night.
Good